This heuristic hope is, of course, more than the idle expectation of a serendipitous find. It is a state of creative readiness. Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf, and welcome to episode 5 of the Why Do We Read Fiction series. Again, I just want to clarify that this series is intended to investigate the impulse within us that draws us to reading specifically as an act. And in terms of entertainment, this would be why do we choose to read, or what pulls us to reading the written word over, say, watching TV shows or listening to music, watching movies? Not that you can't do all these things in your capacity as a human being. I do all those things. But what is it that keeps bringing me back to sitting silently with a book? My investigations have led me to Matei Calinescu's Rereading. This is out from Yale University Press, and it was published in 1993. And I've been slowly venturing through this book over a series of weeks now in a state of thankfulness and delight and hunger to hear more of what Calinescu has to say. Really, to do this book justice, I would have to go way outside of the bounds of this series, which again, I'm trying to keep the scope of each episode fairly tight, fairly focused, and keep the runtime of these videos very, very short. They're meant as provocations, yes, but taking little bits of what we're discovering in this series and highlighting them over a bunch of stuff in one video. Really, I could just sit and read through every single point that I highlighted and comment on that, and who knows, maybe I will. But for this video, I want to focus specifically on the heuristic impulse. So Calinescu argues that we have this heuristic impulse, which heuristics, this is the field of searching. So people working for Google are working in the area of heuristics, improving the way we search, speeding up the way we find things, improving the precision and accuracy with which we find things, but just searching in general. And here specifically, the heuristic impulse is a hope of making a discovery. And he says that this heuristic hope is, of course, more than the idle expectation of a serendipitous find. It is a state of creative readiness. And even if X does not make any specific independent discovery as a result of X's reading of a particular text, it nonetheless strengthens his or her self-confidence and will to creation. And he goes on about this will to creation, and he says, this kind of creative self-consciousness naturally leads to writing. And so there's a lot packed in right there, and I'll touch back on it in a second, but let's move on. He says, we as readers always carry in our mind, most of the time unconsciously, hundreds of not yet answered questions and hypotheses. Reading may at any time, often completely unexpectedly, activate any of these by way of suggesting a possible answer to an old nagging question, an argument in support of an incomplete hypothesis, an interesting consequence of a long-held and half-forgotten assumption. I love how he uses this term creative readiness. And I think that a lot of us are drawn to reading book after book because of this heuristic impulse that keeps us keen to discover. Like he said, to discover more parts to the answer of nagging questions or hypotheses that we've long held, or the discovery of a novel idea. But in any case, this mode of reading creates in us a state of creative readiness. And I like this term because it accurately depicts the fact that both reader and writer are in an act of co-creation. The writer, of course, is creating these prompts and provocations and assertions, ideas, and then the reader is echoing the creative process with creations and fulfillments and enlargements and expansions of the writer's ideas. And it's interesting that Calinescu would take this already nicely put argument and extend it to say that a lot of times, and in my interpretation, this is sort of the highest form of reading under the mode of heuristic impulse or the hope of discovery. Some of the greatest moments we have as readers do indeed prompt the will to write. This is why we have critics. This is why we have book reviewers. This is why we have other writers, because at some point during all of these types of persons' readings, they were so moved by something they read, or so startled, taken aback by something they read, that it rattled them out of their capacity and limitation of reader and prompted them to also write. He expands on this impulse to write that gets activated when we are reading in that mode of heuristic hope. The creative impulse triggered in the active reader by a seminal text explains the use of rereading as a preparation for original writing. In this case, the heuristic hope begins to shade into a goal, albeit a vague, indeterminate, unspecified one. Proust, quoting Emerson and recalling Dante's tribute to Virgil, gives us an eloquent account of rereading as a writer's pre-creative ritual, as a sort of propitiatory practice before setting out to compose and explore unknown regions of thought and imagination. Emerson would rarely begin to write without rereading some pages of Plato, and Dante is not the only poet whom Virgil led to the threshold of paradise. This comes from Proust's On Reading Ruskin, which is to say that reading, or rather rereading, the way Dante read Virgil, not imitating him, but entrusting him with the role of heuristic master and guide, may be an essential part of the creative act. And so, how do we wrap this up? Well, my assertion is that based on these articulations by Matei Calinescu, I think that often there is something within us readers that longs to create. And when we find the right books, and especially the books that cause us to reread over and over, what I think is happening is that these creative writers are actually activating the creative reader within us. And I think that even if we don't act on that prompt to write ourselves, or to, say, make videos and put them on YouTube ourselves, I think that a creative reader can participate in their act of creating within just their own mind. Another way of putting it could be that some of us have the impulse and temperament of artists, yet we haven't become artists and creators in our lives. And so there's something within us, that artistic yearning, that artistic temperament, that is attracted to and activated by other artists. And we get to engage and revel in that artistic activity while we're sitting and reading and rereading books. The other major point that Calinescu brings up is the ludic impulse. That is the impulse to want to play, to have fun, to engage in games and puzzles. And so in episode 6, I will continue with rereading and explore this ludic dimension of what draws us to read and reread.